Alrighty then, so welcome to this evening's session. So the main focus is going to be predominantly what was in Learning Unit 5, and we're going to go over Piaget and Vygotsky and just, their contributions to what we understand to be cognitive development. And we're going to have some discussion around the differences, similarities, the usefulness of these two theories. Cool. So everyone should have been moving on to Learning Unit 6 this week. So I do hope that everyone has at least done some reading on these theories so that we can have a bit of a discussion. Okay, so I think just briefly though, however, to make sure, what do cognitive developmental theories do? Okay, so first of all, cognitive development obviously refers to the process that occurs in humans. Generally, it is understood to be a lifespan kind of approach as well, so happens throughout your lifetime, but obviously starts and occurs quite rapidly in the beginning of life. And it's how we come to acquire, understand, and use knowledge and information. So cognitive theories, a lot to do with learning, a lot to do with memory, memory and recall, any cognitive thinking function, basically. Anything your brain does that is any kind of non-automatic function has got something to do with your cognitive development. Okay. And so Learning Unit 5 very much went over the basics of Piaget and Vygotsky, the two kind of main hitters in this sphere still, really. Everyone's still building on these theories. And they do very largely still hold true in human development that we know of, still at the moment in time. And then this next learning unit is moving into looking more socially at socio-cognitive development, and then also, interestingly, moral development that does stem from that. So that's the trajectory that we are on. Cognitive psych is always very interesting, and it's often seen as quite, I don't know, overwhelming because it is quite content heavy. And there's a lot of kind of biological processes and then mental processes that can be a little bit overwhelming. But actually, when you get the basics of how these theories work, then it starts to make a lot more sense. So hopefully we will establish that kind of thing this evening. Okay, so we've got Piaget and we've got Vygotsky. So these names should be very familiar to you at this stage. They are like household names in psychology. They are really the two of the founding fathers of modern psychology, definitely in cognitive and social psychology. So Piaget is known for his staged developmental theory, and we'll go through those stages now. There are 4 stages, because developmental psychology, we do love a good stage. And then Vygotsky is not a stage theory, but it's a theory that places importance on social interactions and how that very heavily influences one's cognitive development. So it gets very interesting, especially in terms of different environments, different cultural environments, all kinds of stuff. And so they are very much both theories of constructivism. Okay, so just remember the general understanding of constructivism is that we construct knowledge in a particular way, and the way that we come to know things may be dependent on the particular context or environment that we are in. As opposed to something like positivism, which is kind of like straight mathematical science. There is a truth, we know the truth, here's the answer kind of thing. But constructivism is a far more subjective understanding of how human experience is, well, constructed, right? But anyway, we will unpack that as we go along. So I decided not to make very complicated slides to do with this. I mean, your textbook does lay out these stages fairly well, but I'm also gonna pop a couple of articles that I do have in my little memory bank onto my Wakelet page as well, because I noticed they do need a few more there. So you'll be able to go and find some more sources as well. But anyway, so let's get into the stages. So you will see that Piaget's stages range from birth to around 11, 12 years. And then it was thought that at that stage, hence the name formal operational, that these, what he has called schemas, and we'll define them in a minute, are set at this stage, and then don't necessarily change as one grows older in life. That we base everything, the way our thinking and our logic and reasoning, on these schemas and these systems that we built in the previous stages. So it's important just to remember that it is still somewhat considered a little bit of a critique of this theory. In general, we don't like to think that we kind of hit a wall developmentally. We like to think that we can still grow after this phase. But you'll also see that a large part of our education system and medical system and all kinds of things are actually built around the fundamental ideas of Piaget's theory. And so, there's always very interesting room for discussion when it comes to that as well. So we'll try and apply that to that context. But let's briefly go through these stages. Okay, so again, just you need to do reading and things on all the stages to get all of the kind of details of them and, remember the things like the ages. But for now, we're really just going to go over the main points, okay? So the first stage is called the sensory motor stage, and that is because at this age range, so I don't know if any of you have any experience with 0 to 2-year-olds, but they are very sensory driven, okay? And very, kind of developing those motor skills, right? So babies at this age stick everything in their mouths because that is literally how they process the world, is through their senses. So that is a way that you can remember the name for this stage, because it is very much based on that kind of idea. Okay, so at this stage, our cognition is developing through our experience with various objects, really, and our environment, and through our senses in this way. So babies do learn the coordination of different senses, particularly motor responses to stimuli, so to something that provokes their interest. Can anyone think of an example, like of things that people assess young infants for? With this kind of, sorry, my dog. This motor response thing. Okay, so one example is reflexes. So there are a couple of different types of reflexes that you learn about that babies are born with, really, and then they develop later on into fundamental skills. So there's the Babinski reflex. There's the reflex where if you tickle a baby's foot, their toes should curl. That kind of thing. If you touch the corner of a baby's mouth, they should turn their head towards your finger and try to suckle your finger. You can very easily see all of the sort of evolutionary demands that these kind of reflexes are fulfilling, for survival. But it's interesting how babies' brains are literally hardwired to start to explore the world physically in that way through their senses. Okay, and then so language is obviously very rudimentary at this stage. Children don't really learn to speak very fluently by 2. Normally it happens after that. And so generally language starts to be used for things like demands and things like, what we refer to as cataloging, so understanding concepts. Obviously toddlers have fairly limited vocabularies generally. They'll say, want food or whatever. And generally they will be able to express demands towards the end of this stage, hopefully. So the idea is that once they've mastered that sort of thing, then they can move on to the next stage. But also what is interesting about Piaget's stages is that this kind of development does continue anyway with age, because it's the way that our brains develop. Yes, it may be stilted at some stage for various reasons, but it still progresses in time, and then if you compare this to something like Erikson's stages, where he thought that you absolutely have to resolve a crisis at one stage in order to progress to the next one. Piaget is not as limited in the understanding of these stages. Okay, so there's a really important concept that is developed in this first stage as well as the last thing I want to point out is object permanence. Can anyone describe for me very quickly what object permanence is? Anyone? What does it mean when a baby has achieved object permanence? What does it mean? Yes, Nicoletta, good job. Something exists even if it can't be seen. Absolutely, that's the fundamental principle behind it. So up until infants achieve the idea of object permanence, so that, yeah, an object still exists even if though they can't see it. So if I hide behind a door, yeah, children that have achieved this still know that I'm there because they saw me enter the room and then close the door, right? But until this idea has cemented, you just kind of poof, you disappear. And I mean, it can be a bit traumatic, but it makes sense why this often young infants will cry when you put them down or when you walk away or something, because like to them you've ceased to exist basically, because if they don't see it, they're not interacting with it. Or see in a broad sense. If they can't feel or touch or see or smell you, then you kind of don't exist to them. And yeah, so that starts to develop and should be developed fully by 2. I mean, if children aren't understanding object permanence by 2 years old, that is a huge developmental problem. And then, so basically, how this came about and how we test this very often is simply the game of peekaboo. Yeah, when babies understand the point of peekaboo and they like when you cover your face and then they kind of grab your hands and try to find your face again, then you understand that they are starting to grasp the idea that you are still there behind your hands. And yeah, obviously it's just cute and makes them laugh, but it's how we demonstrate that idea. And there are so many like funny videos on the internet of people messing with babies and like, kind of throwing up a sheet and then darting away so it looks like you disappeared, and then the kid like freaks out because they can't see you anymore. And it's really just all experiments around object permanence. Alrighty, is everyone happy with the first stage, the first 2 years of cognitive development? Yeah, when babies see their dads without a beard, that is always a thing. They often like just can't recognize them, and that also it shows you how babies rely on their senses in a very literal way at this age. The abstract thought of being able to recognize the rest of your face if it looks different hasn't quite cemented yet. Same thing a lot of the time, like if you get a drastically different haircut or something, young kids will really struggle to grasp that concept. Yeah, no, it's very fun. They're always funny stories. I think my mom tells a story of one of my older brothers. Like she cut her hair very short once, and then he was like, "You're not my mommy," and yeah, it was like a whole scene when she picked him up from school. So I guess you just have to prep kids that you're going to look different before they've realized this. Okay. However, after 2 years, so we move to the pre-operational stage. So, and this is quite a long period of time, between 2 to 7, but I mean, still in the grand scheme of life, a pretty rapidly developing time. And this is where the idea of symbolic thinking starts to come about, right? So when kids basically start to be able to think about something symbolically without seeing it and interacting with it physically in their minds. Okay, so imagination really starts to develop here. Yeah, you get the sense. I mean, it's always that thing of like toddlers between 2 and 4 telling huge stories, right? Their imagination is really coming into focus because they are now able to think abstractly to a degree. They can imagine. And that starts to develop around this age. And yeah, so imagination and intuition are strong at this stage, but too complex or abstract thoughts are still difficult. And what we mean by abstract thoughts is that hypothetical thought, right? The idea of problem solving, complex problem solving, obviously hasn't developed just yet. So you can already start to see that this understanding is so important for things like an educational system. We're not trying to teach 6-year-olds complex equations because we understand that their brains literally can't cope with that cognition yet, right? Okay, well, in general, obviously, unless there's some weird genius that happens. Right, so that's the main thing. The complex thoughts do start to happen, symbolic thinking being the huge part of that, and then starting to develop more complicated language skills. So yeah, obviously proper syntax and grammar. They're able to start speaking in full sentences and express their emotions and thoughts and things like that. Express their imagination through language. And that's, yeah, language is always a pretty large developmental step in any cognitive theory. Alrighty, so then moving on 7 to 11 years roundabouts as the concrete operational stage. So a way to remember this, and this is why I like this table really, is for this line, is that concepts are attached to concrete situations. So now between 7 and 11 years old, children are learning to attach concepts to concrete understandings that they have developed previously in life, right? They can start to attach meaning of concepts to other fundamental processes that they've learned about. They can start to have comprehension around time, around space, things like quantity. So there's a really cool experiment that people do with 7 to 11 year olds, and actually there are a lot of very cool experiments that you can even go and you guys should go on YouTube. Piaget's experiments, and I mean experiments is like a bad word, but honestly they're just funny games that you play with kids, and they show you these kinds of concepts. But it's this idea of quantity and volume. So I don't know if you've ever seen or ever done this with a child at this age, where if you have, let's say, a skinny glass filled with liquid and then a shorter, fatter, like tumbler filled with the same amount of liquid, but obviously it won't be as high, right? Like we can all understand that, I hope, and that level of abstract thought. But a child that hasn't yet achieved this stage will say, if you ask them which glass has more in it, they'll tell you the taller one has more in it because it looks like more because it goes higher up. So yeah, they learn to now apply that more abstract thinking at this age. Yeah, and they start to be able to interact, right? So they can understand things like time and space and volume and quantity and things as working together and being applied to real life and not just as independent concepts. It's like you can teach a 5-year-old the days of the week, but it doesn't mean they necessarily comprehend that progression of time and what it means in their lives, right? Like, what does it mean to go from Monday to Wednesday to a 5-year-old? Not much. They don't comprehend time in the way that we do later on. Okay, and then yeah, so from around 11 years old, that this formal operational, the last stage, should be established from around 11. And this is really now, according to Piaget, kind of the height of your cognition development. Obviously, we grow it and learn things, but the base skills are developed and are formally operational at this level, right? So they're being able to theorize, to engage in hypothetical situations, counterfactual thinking. So basically being able to problem solve and offer counter arguments to things. Anyone ever tried to have an argument with an 11-year-old? It's a nightmare because they finally know how to argue. Okay. They're able to start piecing together abstract logic and reasoning, and also strategy and planning. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, but a great example of this is like board games and age restrictions on board games. Has anyone ever thought why aside from like choking hazard, why some games have a 7+ years or 12+ year thing on them, right? And it's basically because of this, because younger children aren't necessarily able to grasp, let's say, if it's a strategy planning game like Risk or whatever, right? So yeah, it's super interesting. And honestly, research in cognitive psych forms the basis of so many of our processes. That the more you think about it, really, yeah, the more you kind of like, it's crazy. I have a story about this. So I think I was like 9 or 10. So obviously had not reached formal operational stage yet. And my brother thought he was clever trying to teach me how to play chess, but obviously had no idea how it worked, like, not like fundamentally how chess works, being able to think 3 moves ahead and whatever. And yeah, he thought he was a big man because he beat me in like 3 moves. And I remember throwing like the most almighty tantrum because I just didn't understand why I lost, right? So yeah, there's that thing. And like a game like chess is the ultimate like pinnacle of strategy and planning and this abstract thought. That's why chess is held in such a high esteem, in terms of intellectual ability and things like that. But it's because it engages this formal operational thinking in the mind. So shame. Don't try and teach 7-year-olds how to play chess unless they really are geniuses and somehow develop that skill very early. Okay, so what underlies a lot of these things, when I keep saying processes that are established in things, at the heart of that is what Piaget termed a schema. So you may have, the word schema appears all over biology and things, but what it means in cognitive psychology and developmental terms is it is a cognitive framework, okay, or a concept that helps us organize and interpret information. And the idea is that we develop schemas so that we can understand future interactions with the world. So a very, very basic example is that if you ask, let's say, yeah, someone who's quite verbally, developed, so like a 5-year-old, you ask them like, what does a cat look like? They will paint a pretty basic picture. They'll say, oh, well, they have whiskers and they have 4 paws and they purr and they have a tail, right? And then so basically that's the schema for which they have understood cat. And it's that thing, that's that like filing system basically that we use cognitively to understand things. And so our ability and our ability to draw on and interpret, and then also the complexity of these schemas grows through these stages. And we move from, forming these schemas to then putting them into operation. And yeah, like we don't at this stage need to go into the extremely, detailed parts of how this happens in the brain. But if you can understand that, so something like a baby picking up a toy, they can't do that from day one, right? Okay, so yes, their muscles aren't developed enough, but also cognitively, you need at least 3 schemas to be able to pick up a toy or a rattle or a ball or something. You need to, okay, first of all, look at it and identify it. You need to be able to reach and like accurately target, and you need to be able to grasp something in order to pick it up, right? So these are all schemas that develop like kind of rules on how to do things in your brain, and they all develop through practice. And then eventually we are able to combine schemas to produce an operation or a behavior, okay, an outcome for that. Yeah, so this kind of, I just liked this little diagram to kind of just understand schemas a bit more. You don't need to know necessarily all of these different things, but there are just different types of schemas that we talk about. So we have person or personal schemas. So that's kind of like your self-reflective understanding of yourself, right? So how you understand your appearance and behavior and that kind of thing. Like if I had to ask you to draw a self-portrait, you'd draw on schemas, very many schemas really, to be able to produce that. And I think like if you, and this may just be something to think about, but if you think about something like play therapy and art, well, really art therapy that people do with children, this kind of understanding of the complexity of schemas that children have is fundamental to that process because, yeah, like just what children are able to draw and the complexity of that is absolutely fundamentally based on the level or the amount of schemas that they have. You know, how big is their cognitive framework to draw from, that kind of thing. Righty. And then I just wanted to, and this seems complicated, but I'm going to break it down with a hilarious example. Okay. So you will come across in your reading, and it is important for you to be able to explain this process, even just basically. Okay. I don't think that you'll necessarily need to explain this process in detail, let's say in the exam, but it's possible. So I just wanted to make sure we understand this process. So how do we develop cognitively, right? We know that we have these things called schemas that develop. We know that somehow they become more complex through our interactions. And then, somehow we end up as this cognitively developed thing, this human. And so this is the process that happens. It's through assimilation and through accommodation, and then the steps that happen in between that. So assimilation basically is if you think about the word assimilation, like you assimilate to something, like you take it on board, you blend in, you're comfortable with it, right? So when you're in a phase of assimilation, you're happy, you understand a concept. Absorb, yeah, good one. I don't know if any of you are Star Trek fans, but it always just takes me like assimilate. Anyway, so yeah, like you absorb it, you understand. Fundamentally, you are comfortable with how you see the world with your current schemas. Okay, and then so this is also just what is described then as a state of equilibrium. Okay, we think about equilibrium, it's like equality, equal, peace, yay, everything's balanced. Okay, so then you're plodding along as a person in the world and you are super happy that you understand what things are. And then boom, you are met with a new situation, something you have never encountered before. And now your brain like breaks for a second, because if we're working on this model that we understand situations based on previous experiences, obviously a new situation kind of halts that process, right? But this is what happens. And through this process of disequilibrium, so basically like you're breaking down this idea, you think about the new information, it does create this discomfort cognitively. As basically cognitive dissonance is what we talk about as confusion, right? So you're learning maths, you're sitting in maths class, someone now introduces a letter into the number system, and then like, boom, disequilibrium. Some of us never get over that. I am still traumatized by algebra. Anyway, right, and then so this is this idea, and then so it's when two or more schemas conflict basically in your brain. And then in order for you to understand and accept the new information, you have to adjust the conflicting schemas, right? And then in theory, it's like slotting Lego bricks together. You find a way to make them fit together that now makes sense with the new situation. And then, yay, we start again, we're happy, and then another new situation pops up and we start again. And this is basically very much the building blocks of what we understand all learning to take place, how it takes place cognitively. So this little, and I tried to make this make sense on the right-hand side here, and I think it will once I explain it. But yeah, like a very basic example of this always is used is how, so children, and also like remember limited language at the stage we're talking about, will learn what a dog is. You know, they're like, oh, head, body, four paws, tail, you know, cute, has ears, dog. Right. Our mom reads a book, shows us pictures, labels it dog. We learn that's what dog is. Okay. We then are happy with it and can maybe, you know, identify other dogs that look different to Paw Patrol that we encounter on TV and be like, ooh, look, dog. And then, yay, it gets reinforced, right? Our parents are like, absolutely, you absolute genius. You can label a dog, winning. Okay. But then this new situation appears. You see Bambi for the first time and you're like, oh, look, 4 legs, nose, head, body, tail, ears. Dog. Must be dog, right? Must be a different type of dog. And then your parents are like, hopefully, no, it's not a dog, whatever, blah, 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 explain to you what a deer is. And then you're like, what? Right? So your brain, you try to comprehend and then you try to build, you end up basically complicating what you understood to be this animal that has these features as dog is now more complex. There are different types of animals that have these features, but for instance, this one is a deer and not a dog, in like the most simple, rudimentary way. But this literally happens with kids, right? It happens quite often. Like often a child, whatever their first pet they encounter, like they'll learn what a dog is, and then they'll see a cat and be like, dog. Yeah, often you'll see, and it's that state of disequilibrium. And it almost like really reinforces our esteemed responsibility as like humans to like not teach children the wrong thing, because that's how vulnerable they are, especially at this stage, to develop schemas around things. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And then obviously once that process has happened, we've resolved the disequilibrium, we've accommodated and moved into assimilation. Now kid sees Bambi and says deer and not dog. Does that help, or is that just ridiculous? I don't know. I thought it might help. Cool. So I mean, essentially, and I love this diagram. It's a good one that I found, and it's much better than what's in your textbook. But anyway, to describe this process, and just the more you try and relate it to things that you're learning. Ironically, you're all currently in a state of disequilibrium, right? Like learning new things. And that's what we're trying to do. You're trying to accommodate that information and then build on it. All right, so that is Piaget in a nutshell. Does anyone have any confusion, any questions around Piaget? Are you relatively comfortable with him and his stages? Ooh. It's a pretty important one developmentally. And even when we go into kind of other realms, even more psychodynamic theories, of the idea that we build models. So a lot of attachment theory actually draws on this process in a more psychodynamic way, and that we build models, and then we of relationships that we experience, and then model that in the future. But that's a different topic. Anyway, this whole idea of that we generate the idea, we experience new things, it complicates the idea, and we assimilate, right? Okay. All right, so let's move on to Vygotsky. Vygotsky is the social guy. Okay, so basically it's the fundamental difference is that Piaget is all about cognitive mental processes, and Vygotsky said, hold up, dude, this doesn't happen in isolation. Humans don't grow up in like an isolated space. We have social interaction. And Vygotsky argued that learning is a social process and is really at the origin of human intelligence and society and developing cultures and all that. Like he argued that it's not possible really to develop cognitively without the social interaction element. And there's fair arguments to this. I don't know if any of you are doing sociology, but I mean, really the idea of socialization is that it's an end product of social interaction, right? And then there are all those stories of like kids that are raised by wolves or whatever, and they're not socialized. And then they also lack more complex. I'm going to find the documentary and share it with you guys because it's actually a bit of a mind boggle. It's a real thing that did happen. But if kids aren't socialized, to whatever standards that we generally have, that cognitive development is stunted. And so that's what he discovered and then argued. And it makes a whole lot of sense, obviously. But basically it's this idea that social interaction precedes any other type of development. It's what builds consciousness and cognition. Okay, they are the end product of social interaction. Okay, so at the root of this, a person's cognitive development is contingent on their surrounding environment, their culture, all sorts, right? So I think this is a good point for discussion as well. It's not the most complicated theory. It's really just about this idea of social interaction. So, I mean, does anyone maybe have any ideas, any examples to share on how you think, I mean, this really applies to cognitive development? You think about just how humans develop cognitively and how social interactions can have bearing on that. Nicoletta, makes you think of Amala and Kamala. What do you mean? What do you want to explain? Yeah, homeschooling. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of argument that homeschooling does stunt, I mean, social development, surely, but does it necessarily stunt cognitive development? Is because you still technically, like, homeschooling children are still interacting socially with whoever's tutoring them, albeit limited. Yes, the feral children. I forgot what their names were, but that's the example. Yeah, we must share an example of that. Cool. Okay, let me just explain. This diagram got a bit blurry. That's okay. So yeah, these four kind of like components are important to how you understand Vygotsky's cognitive developmental theory. Okay, so yeah, I'll come back to this feral children thing now and relate this because it's a good point. Okay, so first of all, just social interaction. So what we understand that to mean is literally, the social interaction one human with another human. And that plays this fundamental role. Okay, so first of all, that's the first thing. You have to view the rest of this theory from that lens. Okay. Okay, so then there's this other concept called the MKO, otherwise known as the more knowledgeable other. Okay, and that's just basically that person that plays the role of educator in a child's life. So obviously teachers are more knowledgeable than others, but a parent, right? So a parent is more knowledgeable about using a spoon than a baby is. And they are the person that uses collaborative like guidance to upskill the baby on how to use a spoon, okay, essentially. But yeah, it's kind of just that mental role. And so Vygotsky argued that humans need that interaction in order to, fully access that new skill, that cognitive ability, right? And then so what happens is you go through what he called a zone of proximal development. I've got a diagram that will make this make all sense now. But basically, it's very basically the difference between what a learner or a pupil or whoever can do without help. So like what's easy for them to do, what they can achieve in the middle with guidance. That's the zone of proximal development. And then on the outside, what they can't do even with guidance. And basically, the theory is that incorporating scaffolding, so the support that a child is provided through the zone of proximal development, is then able to reach that otherwise previously unreachable state, right? So yeah, let's look at it this way. Okay, so look, the zone of proximal development is the fundamental point of Vygotsky's theory, so very important for you guys to understand this and how it applies, really. Yeah, so we understand in the middle, if you think of this like an astro, right? So like the biscuit layer in the middle, that would be one's current understanding on something. Like you guys currently understand psychology 1 topics really well, or anything you've like completed up until now, right? But you are now moving, because you can do that now unassisted, hopefully, and you are now in the zone of proximal development, learning about developmental psychology. This got weirdly meta, but anyway, through scaffolding. And so essentially, and so much of teaching and teaching theory, if any of you are interested in education, is built around this zone of proximal development and around scaffolding, and how we use scaffolding basically to prop up, and that's why the term is used, scaffolding, so to reinforce and to, just like provide a walking frame through that learning to reach the out of reach knowledge or skills. Yeah, so really it's all the same diagram over and over again. But it's just this fundamental idea that seems like general knowledge, but if you can imagine before this understanding took place, like it was groundbreaking, that we need the more knowledgeable other to guide us through this zone of proximal development, to be able to reach beyond these previous boundaries, right? The idea is that this space is not traversable without that social interaction, basically, and that is the point of Vygotsky. Piaget would probably argue like, no, dude, it's a matter of time. Children will figure it out on their own eventually and, proceed. But Vygotsky would argue vehemently that no, it's all on the basis of social interaction that you can get through that space. Okay. So, and I mean, it's almost like you can see it unfolding and it makes perfect sense, right? Like if you've ever seen a kid struggle to do something, like struggle to do a puzzle, that's a perfect example, is building puzzles, okay? It can be a frustrating thing to teach a kid to use a puzzle, but also rewarding when you see them get it right. And if you've ever guided like a toddler through putting shapes in a puzzle thing, it's like you can literally see that zone and them learning the process of like how to build a puzzle. And it would just take immeasurably longer in general, obviously in theory, for them to have understood how to do it without guidance, without being shown how to do it, and also encouragement. So there is a strong aspect of this emotional support as well for scaffolding. It's not just showing people how to do it, it's encouraging and guiding and walking together through the problem to learn how to solve the problem. Okay. Yeah. Any questions about zone of proximal development? Take the silence that we understand. Ah. Yes, so yeah, Nicoletta, correct. Yeah, so I mean, one of the absolute main salient differences is that Piaget said that we should individually be able to develop, that these cognitive processes happen individually. But then Vygotsky argued that you need the social scaffolding. Yeah, it's also quite interesting when you look at it culturally, in terms of very individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures. We have, I mean, Piaget is French, right? So like super Western, super individual kind of culture. It makes sense by the observations that he had that children develop independently. But Vygotsky clearly had more of an understanding of the collectivist idea. Yeah, so this idea of feral children, you guys can go and look it up, and it's actually wild. They did find a pair of feral children, yeah, in India. I mean, when was this? This was ages ago. It was pre-2000. But then sociologists really flocked to it to explain the significance of socialization and that social interaction, because it was believed that these children weren't raised by humans. They somehow, adapted and survived on their own, or with their woodland friends. Yeah, in the 30s. And so when they found them, they were literally feral, right? They couldn't speak. They were like aggressive. They literally acted like animals. Um, had those very primal, like defensive instincts, that kind of thing. And I mean, that just puts huge weight onto Vygotsky's theory, that you need the social interaction for the cognitive development, and not just the social aspect of development. Remember, they are like socialization is an important part of cognitive development. And Vygotsky absolutely argues that it comes first and it's necessary to guide the cognitive development. But according to Piaget, cognitive ability should develop even in the absence of that, of sophisticated like socialization. Here is a little table of differences. Yeah, so just according to the different views, they just view things differently, right? So learning, according to Vygotsky, we now understand is that it's social. Children work with others to develop, to build knowledge, to move forward. But Piaget would argue that learning is a solitary experience and that children explore their environment independently, and that's how they learn. Okay. Yeah, so then development is then driven, and so Vygotsky would say development is driven by that more knowledgeable other, by the social influence. Children are guided through, prompted through development that way. But Piaget, very much classical, just, you're prompted to develop by the movement to the next stage of development, right? Yeah, we've pretty much highlighted all of these differences, really. Yeah, so Piaget has stages, and development is continuous, but Vygotsky doesn't have stages, but agrees that development is continuous, right? Because they are both constructivist theories. At the end of the day, there is common ground. Okay, so then really the converse thing, and I meant to make a little diagram about this, but it's okay. So the role of language here is kind of flipped on its head with each of them. So according to Vygotsky, language drives thought development, right? Through the social interaction, we learn language, and therefore it drives thought. But Piaget argues that you develop cognitively, you develop thought processes first that then drive the development of language. Yeah, like in that kind of way. It's that, but for Vygotsky, language plays an absolutely fundamental role in driving thought process. But Piaget would say that language is basically just the vehicle that our brain uses to express thoughts. Yeah. Yeah, you put it really well there, Nicola. It's like the independent exploration versus social interaction. Absolutely. That's literally the difference between these theories. Okay. So this thing I basically actually included so you guys could access it when I embed the slides. So it's quite cool. I found this little presentation someone made at some point. And it's this Venn diagram of the theories and what's similar between them, and obviously what intersects in the middle. And so you kind of click through it and it zooms in. But yeah, I thought this would be kind of a fun interactive learning tool for you guys. So it will be there when I embed the slides, so you can interact with it. Cool. Yeah, I want to learn how to make these. It's very cool. Yeah. yeah, so you guys can go play with that in your own time. Okay, are we all happy with this topic? More or less comfortable with Piaget and Vygotsky? Are you comfortable enough to do a quick quiz? It'll be fun, I promise. Okay. I don't know if you guys have ever used quizzes before, but I love it. It's quite fun. I may have to exit and go into it in my browser, but this should work. No. Okay, never mind. I need to give me one moment and I'll display the link for you guys to join. But if you do have the app, you can open up the app. If you don't, it's fine. I'm going to put a QR code to scan, but also just the joining code. So you can either just go to the website, it's quizzes, spelled like that, .com. Alrighty. Sorry, I'm just making sure the settings will work. Cool, let me swap my screen. It's coming. Okay, I think make this bigger. There we go. Okay, so you can just scan this on your phone and keep your laptop where you are. You don't have to like leave the session or anything, because I'll obviously play what I can see through here. Or you could just go to quizzes.com and put in the code to join. And I should see you guys popping up here now. And you can like put whatever name or whatever you want. I think you can choose a little thing. Anyone else playing? Come on. Cool. While we wait for you to join. So how it works is quite cool. You basically progress through the questions in your own time, but you do accrue points. And obviously you get lots of points for getting it right. But also the quicker you answer the question, the more points you get. So it's a whole competitive thing. And you'll see on this screen the kind of like leaderboard changes as we progress through the quiz. So it's just quite fun, brings a bit of a competitive edge to it. And the questions are quite simple, just based on the presentation from tonight. Cool, is anyone still joining? I think so. Okay, I think we'll wait like a minute for everyone who's trying to join, but just let me know if you're ready to go. We just have 5 players. Okay, cool. So we're running out of time. I'm just gonna start. I think you can still join and like join in and start playing anyway. Okay. What do you mean it's not working? Did you lose connection or does appear to be working for some? So the question should start popping up when it started. Is there a tab here that says questions maybe? Hard for me to see what's wrong because I can't see. Oh no, you got disconnected. I suppose that's the downfall of doing online games. It's okay. I'll leave it open so you guys can just like play, and then see who the winner is at the end. Nicoletta has won for now, but you never know. Oh, dethroned. Rebecca, you're on fire. 11 questions correct in a row. You're. Yeah, it is a lot of fun. And we can try again next time as well. Hopefully the tech will work. Cool. Shame. For those of you guys who do want to like just rejoin, I guess if you got these disconnected, I'll just let it play for a little while. in the background, so you can just finish. But yeah, thanks guys. Have a good evening, and I will see you next time.